They ask me why I search for a river in a desert, as I stand drenched in the pouring rain. How do I explain the pleasure of rains on a hill or the parched disappointment of a mirage in the desert should be the consequence of my choice alone?
Chains is the fifth production that we made based on narratives told through the medium of Bharatanatyam, not based in mythology or folklore. Being the fifth production, I was not worried about this format being accepted by audiences. I had tasted success with our earlier productions. The response that Chains elicited across the world was something that even I could not have imagined. People connected very deeply with the concept and the story, and they came up to me and said that this was their story. While Chains is a narrative about the invisible and subtle bondage of women, male audience members told me that this was their story also.
Chains is not a work of fiction, and there is no coincidence in the resemblance it bears to the lives of people, living or otherwise. The inspiration for Chains comes from the lives of people that have acted as beacons in our journey, mine and Savitha's. And it is these disparate lives that come together as one in this presentation through the eyes of one protagonist. We call her Vichitra. And it's amazing how these different stories come together so seamlessly as one when portrayed through the life of one woman. Different times, different circumstances, but it seems to flow together as though it all happened in one person's life. Perhaps these stories are not as uncommon as we may imagine them to be.
After my first production, Soul Cages, I fell in love with Shree's story about a middle-aged woman caught between the realities of her life and her desire to pursue her own dreams. We had then decided to produce it as a smaller production of about 20 to 25 minutes in length and play it at venues with a smaller and intimate audience. However, I got busy with some other projects, and by the time we came back to Chains, it was 3 years later. Chains was then called as 1 by X. Shree had to then write a prequel and a sequel as we decided to present it as a full-length production. Collectively, now you see it as Chains.
Chains is a trilogy based on Vichitra's life, Vichitra, our protagonist. And it follows her life through 50 years, represented in 3 phases. So the first part looks at Vichitra's life when she's a young teenager. As an adolescent, she falls in love with a boy called Advik. And Advik has a condition that we know as Asperger's syndrome. While Vichitra is convinced that she is in love with Advik, her parents and her relatives think otherwise, because they think Vichitra is too young to be making these decisions, and the boy is insane. The love story of Vichitra comes to a very quick end when her parents decide to back her up and get her married off and send her to a place far, far away to live the dreams that they had in mind for her. The second part of the story follows Vichitra, who's now middle-aged. She lives a life of a decent degree of comfort with her children, her husband, her mother-in-law. They live in this place where every day is like any other. She is caught up in the mundanities of everyday existence, getting the children ready, taking care of her husband, taking care of her in-laws, and living life pretty much the same way every day. The story moves on where she starts dreaming that there is a figure in a spotlight which is beckoning her to it, and she starts going to the spotlight, she starts dancing in the spotlight, and these dreams become very recurrent. to a point where it's difficult for her to figure out where the dream ends and where the reality starts. And it's a part of her life which is metaphysically examining how much can she give away from her real life to get into her dream life, until she's yanked back to her real life by her family. The last part of Chains shows Vichitra in her advanced years. She is living by herself, and she now accepts solitude as her soulmate. She was first very scared of solitude. She ran away from that condition of loneliness, but she eventually came to terms with it, accepted it, and actually started falling in love with it. She personifies solitude as a human being with whom she converses, she talks, she exchanges ideas. To the rest of the world, it just appears that Vichitra has gone senile and perhaps even insane, because she's talking with somebody nobody can see. But as far as Vichitra is concerned, she is happy where she is. The story of Chains is narrated by Solitude, who we personify as somebody that has been pursuing Vichitra all her life, till in the end, in her advanced years, she accepts Solitude as her soulmate. But I think the crux of the story is, there is this vivacious young girl, Vichitra, who had so many dreams in her eyes, and what came out of her life was an old woman coming to terms with living with solitude. So that spark of life that we all have in our, that spark which we all have in our lives, where does it go? What happens to it? Where do we lose it in our journey of life? I think these are the questions, amongst many others, that Chains attempts to ask and perhaps answer.
The chains we speak of is invisible to society. But we wanted to ask the question, who scripts your life? At 16 years of age, Vichitra's parents scripted her life. When she was at the age when she had a family, her husband, her children told her how to run her life. And when she was much older, her grown children and even neighbors seemed to have an opinion on her senility and whether she could manage her life living on her own. So at which stage was Vichitra allowed to make her own decisions? At every stage, everyone around Vichitra wanted to do the best for her. No one wanted to harm her. Her husband, her children, her family had always her best interests in their mind. This is why we said that the chains are invisible, and yet they exist. Had Vichitra's husband been a drunk or abusive, her decision would have been possibly more easy to understand. But what do you do when people around you presume to know you better than you yourself? Traditionally in Bharatanatyam, women have been portrayed as wronged in the stories of Draupadi when she was disrobed, or when Sita was banished from the kingdom when she was pregnant. Even today, stories about women that have been wronged seem to center around sexual or marital abuse or incidents that are newsworthy. I consider this just the tip of the iceberg. No, I am not talking about unreported crimes. I'm talking about women who lead everyday normal lives and have husbands who are considered supportive. And yet, even in these lives, there appears to be a pecking order. The women seem to always be below the interests, the careers, the passions of her husband and her children. It is these chains that we speak about.
Our lives move like rivers, tumultuous and tempestuous in youth, deep and mysterious when the river hits the plains, anxious and accepting when the river goes on to meet the sea. And these are the three faces of Vichitra's life that you will find depicted in Chains, where it follows from a literal look at an adolescent's life to philosophical examination of life in its middle age, and abstract when we look at Vichitra in her advanced years.
In choreographing Chains, I had the difficult task of showing a woman in three very different stages of life, traversing through almost 50 years. And I had to do this without any changes to makeup or costume, and yet take the audiences through as though it is happening in front of them. In the first part, Vichitra is 16 years of age. So I used movements that are stylized, even flamboyant perhaps, with an attitude that only a 16-year-old could display. As she matures and comes to the middle stages of life, Vichitra is expected to become the pillar of strength for her family. And when she has aspirations of her own, her life starts to crumble. So I had the task of showing somebody who was not even allowed to dream her dreams freely. I had to display her as having a constant feeling of living a life that someone else expected. In the last part of Chains, I had to convey two major emotions, starting with fear, coursing through resignation, ending with acceptance and peace. Loneliness or isolation is the narrator in Chains depicted as the shadow of Vichitra. The physical appearance of shadow becomes more and more apparent as Chains progresses until at one stage Vichitra is seen dancing with shadow, pursued by shadow and paralyzed by fear. Who can run away from their own shadow? Who can run away from isolation? Whether the world accepts Vichitra's resolution at the last stage of her life is a question. What other choice was she left with?
So maybe you'd like to tone down the last part a little bit.
Did it become too sad?
A little too sad. Maybe you want to keep it to wistfulness and not go.
Take it to
Yeah,
sadness.
yeah.